a while back they asked an famous bank robber, why do you rob banks? And he had the answer, that's where the money is. So you can now ask a hacker, why do you hack health systems? And that's because that's where the data is. So I'm personally, I have a background in financial services, and so for a long time I've been working on securing complex systems. But we see now a very similar need in the healthcare industry. So maybe Michael, you can explain what you're seeing, what our customers are asking about when it comes to, how do we secure ourselves against threats, and what are these threats, and who are the people actually breaking in for what purpose?
So yes, thanks, Jeroen. I mean, if you think about it, the hackers definitely go for where they can get value. And one of the statistics, I believe, from the Ponemon Institute had pointed out that the data rich in the records of a person from a health perspective is almost 3 times the value of what you would normally get if you just took someone's credit card. Okay. And again, there's also the whole notion of, in some societies, if I take that particular health information, it becomes tremendously hard for you to correct your records and your information. So if it says that you've already had a splenectomy and you haven't because you're trying to avoid certain payments, they sell that information on the black market, and they are able to get access to that type of data and information. So it is very, very critical. Also, when we look at what the industry is seeing, there is a major notion around hospitals and a number of the customers in our ecosystem that they want to be able to disrupt their operations and how they're able to operate on a day-to-day basis. And so by holding systems hostage also makes that interoperability of the whole network and the ecosystem much more, vulnerable.
So if you look at it, there are different types of hackers, if you will. So you have the guy in the attic room who just want to prove he's smarter than the hospital. But many of them are criminal gangs that basically want to get ransom for holding hostage, or they're stealing patient data to resell in the black market. But there's also state-sponsored threats where hospitals are critical infrastructure, and therefore they're vulnerable. How do you see the threat landscape?
So right now, just as you said, and I'll put the connotation, so the ethical one that wants to try to prove and help enrich the ecosystem, we call that our white hat. Yep. So they are clearly, purely trying to, identify, work with organizations, point out where there are vulnerabilities and threats. What we've seen a major increase is that a number of those white hat hackers are communicating and working directly with organizations and companies like Philips. And so we have a responsible disclosure coordinated process in place. We work with them, they provide us with that information and data on our solutions, and we work with them on the right remediation strategies for vulnerabilities. When you get into that black hat type of, that's where you have the dark web, there's organizations and people that kind of thrive on how to be disruptive because, number one, they do want to show, harm, whether or not it's to the system, whether it's the hospitals or others, or if they just want to, to kind of compromise. And then there's this middle of the ground where we have what we call the gray hat. They haven't proven, that they have operated with demise, but some of their end results become, very not productive. So for example, we've seen some of the work around insulin pumps and also, with the pacemakers and the communications. Well, if you communicate that information and you do it in such a way that doesn't allow the organizations that are developing and maintaining those systems to make sure that there's the right remediation, and you produce what those vulnerabilities and codes are so that others can get access, inadvertently it causes havoc in the system.
So you're mentioning a scenario that's top of mind of many people. So, for instance, my daughter wears a continuous glucose meter that may not be that dangerous, but we've all seen the episode of Homeland where they hacked the pacemaker and the vice president dies because of the manipulation of that pacemaker. So, but I think it calls for a different kind of approach when we connect these medical devices. We have to make sure that that connection is secure, that it's impossible for somebody who's unauthorized to get basically control of a device, to make sure that that device is also connected to the right person. So how do you see the world of secure connected devices? Because that's a world that's emerging very rapidly.
So for the way that I see the marketplace is that everything is going to be connected. We have to make that assumption that in order to transmit and to have a society that continues, that there has to be that connectivity. So knowing that we're going to have that connectivity, we really have to look at our development processes, and there's two phases of that. We know that there are a number of legacy systems and products and solutions that wasn't developed and built to be in that connected environment. And how we address that legacy issue is something that the entire, as we call it, medical, ecosystem is going to have to do. So the manufacturers have responsibility in looking at what types of patching and updates that they can have. The hospitals and organizations, they also have responsibilities around sunsetting and adhering to certain life cycles within the products and the solutions. And then when we look at the advent around the regulators and the different stakeholders that play into that, how that they can make sure that there's the right remuneration that's provided into the system in order to make sure that there's a good balance. So that's on the entire legacy side. Yeah. And then when we look at some of the future devices and activities that we're doing, one of the major areas is to make sure that there is within your development process certain key milestones that we look at, and to make sure that testing is one of those major. So you have to make sure that either from an external or as we do at Philips internally, we have a dedicated team to do that actual hacking and testing of our products during the development life cycle. And then we also have to make sure that there's a very strong risk assessment process where you're weighing what are all of the different threat models that might take place within your environment. So if you execute that and then you continually feed in those vulnerabilities and the threats that you see and monitor from the external environment into your development process, it becomes very iterative, and then you have to maintain that going forward, not only on our future, but as well as to try to clean up and work on the legacy area.
So you mentioned these tests and these gates, but clearly there's something called security by design. And maybe you can explain what that means.
So security by design means that you don't want to build and design your architecture and bolt on at the end of a design process. So very from the beginning, when it's the concept and ideation, we have security as a component that's one of those checkpoints. So even in the design of the architecture, so when Jeroen just talked about pairing up with the right access point of the product or the solution, you have to be designing that from a secure perspective in that process. So I might in the future, where we would use encryption or the need for logging into a system, if I'm designing by secure by design through that life cycle, I'll look at different ways around addressing that security mechanism and the access point. So maybe it's biometrics, maybe it's some other form of authentication that you can use. But if you don't think about that throughout that design process and start at the very beginning and make sure that that secure by design is in your solution set, it becomes very hard in order to build that in after the fact.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things that, as I said, my background is financial services, so what we always looked at is do you really have the right identity and access management? So can you identify the device? Can you properly identifying. You talked about authentication, you talked about biometrics, so I think that's a very important aspect. So does Michael, is he really the person he claims to be? Can we prove that? And what rights does he have? Can he only read the data? Can he actually configure the device? Can he connect to the device? And that device should know about you as well. So I think this whole identity and access management becomes very important of the device, of the person, even of the software. But you also mentioned a second thing, which I believe is critical, which is the end-to-end encryption. So making sure that there's no sensitive data in the clear, so that it's very hard to compromise it. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Because if you do the end-to-end encryption, then that eliminates that risk level and the value of that particular, that data. And again, when you describe the identity and the access piece, we really want to make sure that it doesn't disrupt the workflow. So as we are designing what the workflow happens to be and how we can make sure that that is conducive in the hospital and other environments, or with the patient's interaction, with the clinicians, you have to take that into consideration with that design process.
Now, you said everything is going to be connected, and most hospitals already have their EMR installed, which is running in their data center. But if we connect everything to everything, we clearly open it up for vulnerabilities, because people, that the hackers will find the back door, they will find the little window that they can open and get in. So how do you look at this security end-to-end, where we may have Philips devices, Philips software interacting with Cerner software, some of it running in the cloud, some of it running into the data center? How can we make sure the whole, is secure?
So a couple of different factors. Well, number one, I know there's this notion around and reservations about moving information into the cloud. I believe the cloud is there, and it's there for a particular reason. Yes, it becomes a potential bigger target in terms of arrow on your back from a vulnerability perspective. But when we work with a number of the pure cloud providers, they look at securing that information and doing some of that end-to-end security and encryption, and they typically don't want to have unencrypted data come into their environment. That's number one. So if you encrypt the data when it's data at rest and in transit, which aligns with a number of regulatory requirements, you eliminate some of that particular risk that aligns there. So that's one notion around with the cloud. The interoperability piece, again, the way in which we try to focus on that is, and when they announced that I was a part of the cybersecurity task force, well, that task force we looked at cuts across medical device, healthcare IT, and it begins to start working around some of the standards. So if we are aligning and developing our solutions with that interoperability and using a common, set of language that we're interfacing with and a common component, then we can be able to exchange and move that information very securely. Some of the areas, obvious avenues that we're looking at when you look at like blockchain. Yeah. So there are some steps, and again, participating in a number of the standards bodies and committees internationally helps us to be able to drive some of that activity as well.
So what I hear you saying is, HL7 or FHIR or these kind of interfaces are great, but they're not sufficient, because we need to overlay that with a set of security standards, the security handshakes, handling things end-to-end in terms of encryption and permissions. So I think that's really important, and happy to hear that we play a proactive role in that. Now, switching gears, if you look at a lot of the hacks are actually starting with phishing. Mm-hmm. So, people sending emails or pointing you to websites where you click and it starts downloading code that finds its way into the network. So what do you see are the means to stop that basically at the source, if you will?
It's obviously the more that there's education, awareness, training, in the environments where they're the users. That's the very initial, components that have to be put in place. I think every environment is going to see that advent. So doing that and doing that awareness is one. There's other tools that are out there that organizations can leverage where, number one, if you do click on, something in there, you have your particular operations center and your internal IT and security teams that are able to immediately take a look, block that type of data and information so that it doesn't spread within their environment. Data leakage protection tools happen to fit into that type of space and category. So those are also immediate types of activities that can address those. But again, I would say for everyone, all of us, the heart and soul is to make sure that there's the right awareness and the education, and it's continuous, because the hackers are not going to stop, nor are they, and in a lot of cases, they want to plant things into your environments and then just let them fester and be blatant so that they can act upon it.
So if you look at the threats we've seen, like WannaCry, they're getting more and more sophisticated. WannaCry actually originated from the NSA. So we also see that it's sort of an asymmetrical approach, because it's very, you can sit in Ukraine and launch an attack with very little risk to you personally. So I assume we can expect more and more sophisticated attacks. How do we make sure we collaborate with others? Because it's not just Philips that's being attacked, it's everybody being attacked. So I assume we're doing much more of a coordinated counterattack or defense. So what are the organizations you're working with? So
in a lot of instances, what we clearly see is that there are a number of what we call CERTs, so organizations that are dedicated for looking at incidents and response and threat intelligence. Here in the United States, you have the National Health Information Sharing and Analysis Council. Philips, I'm also a member of that. And I'm on their board of directors. That, from the healthcare perspective, not only do we share among all of the members within the healthcare and medical sector, but there's also a national health center across financial services, aviation, etc. So these councils become to share that vulnerability, that threat intelligence, and be able to disseminate that information very, very readily among ourselves, and to be able to get that intelligence back into the environments. Again, we also are proactively working with organizations like Department of Homeland Security and their ICS CERT intelligence sharing. We also work within the Netherlands and other countries where they have their own specific CERTs. And so we're seeing this advent of this intelligence sharing and threat analysis globally beginning to build. Philips also participates within the World Economic Forum. So the WEF has stood up a cyber center, and they also have a very interconnected component around the Internet of Things and technology. And so they build how-to and documentation globally in order to bridge the gap within the organizations. And then I think the last piece for us that we're on our horizon that we're looking at managing, how do we work with our customers specifically with the intelligence and the information that they're seeing in their environment, as well as what we're seeing on our solutions that the hackers might be trying to get access to, and to how we can proactively monitor and feed that type of information and data, and share that among the environment of our customers as well.
So I want to pick up on that last point, because a lot of our customers, virtually every discussion I have, it's when we talk about interoperability, creating longitudinal views of the patient, immediately the question comes up, what about privacy? What about security? What role can you play in it? What role should I play? So what advice do you have to the customers that explicitly ask these questions and are very concerned about the integrity of the data that they process on behalf of their patients?
So I think we have, and this kind of goes back to a blog that I think you did almost 10 or 15 years ago in that range. And again, the very first component is that we consider, the owner of the data, the actual patient, the consumer, that is their data and their information. Now, in order for us to build that longitudinal strategy and to be able to leverage the richness of that data, you have to have the right mechanisms in place. And so from a privacy perspective, making sure that we're getting the appropriate consents and permissions, up front when we design those solutions and how we gather that information and data. And then secondly, obviously making sure from the connectivity that the right security is in place. And that goes back again to our encryption and to be able to do the end-to-end as well as as you said, the identity and the access management piece.
So it's interesting, if you think about it, about 20 years ago, the global payment networks were put in place. And now you can you don't even need to touch, you can swipe your phone. All the PIN pads around the world are encrypted in the same way. There are both data exchange as well as well-established security standards. They're established anywhere, so you can actually authorize a transaction anywhere in the world. Do you see that happening in healthcare as well?
I do see that happening in healthcare. I believe that we are trying to, though a few years behind in terms of our pace, leverage some of those same elements that you just described that was in the financial services sector. But I think what you're going to see right now, and in my opinion, is that there's an escalation around certain areas of pain points that we have, and that you're going to see from a regulation and a standards perspective kind of accelerating that in the healthcare industry to bring that forward. We just recently, with the House, in terms of the Energy Committee, which oversees in the United States the Health and Human Services area, just reached out and began to start providing additional letter and direction around some of the recommendations that came out of the task force. And that very first one was around the bill of materials. And so the push is that in order to understand what vulnerabilities you have, you need to understand the ingredients that make up your solution. And it's a real push for the manufacturers to be able to provide that type of data and information to the users of the products and the solutions. And they want to see how we can accelerate that, which I then believe by knowing what makes up the components and the solution, and then being able to aggressively manage that and the exchange of that information, that's where the standards piece comes into play. It becomes a much more focused area for us. And that's where I believe you'll see us begin from a healthcare perspective and health tech to kind of catapult in more of a leadership role.
So many of these issues have been addressed at scale by the financial services industry. Should healthcare pick up on that and see how they can leverage that?
They're trying. Again, I think that we're still a good decade behind in terms of some of the pain that the financial services has gone through, and trying to coalesce the many different sectors that have a stake in this. So there's a lot of different organizations that clearly want to participate and do the right thing, even from a procurement perspective within the customers and our segments. And so it's how do we align and pull together, cohesively all of those stakeholders.
So what would be your advice to, a hospital CEO when it comes to cybersecurity?
So one of the very first keys is that whether or not it's inside or out, what I would first say is that there's some basics. And so some of those basics, for me, we look at what I consider to be 3 deadly sins. And I call these the 3 deadly sins because in this day and age, no organization, whether or not it's that hospital CEO or CIO, would it be acceptable for not executing them. One of the first we've talked about, which is around encryption. Clearly encryption of the solutions and making sure that that encryption is turned on, is being executed, that you're requesting it and looking for it as a component, which your device and manufacturers happens to be one.
Yeah, because if it's if it's in the clear, it's easy to use it. If it's encrypted, it's very hard to
Correct.
do anything with.
And so that same notion about the encryption piece goes into the second one, which is around the hard-coded credentials that is there. The ability to have, passwords available in the clear allows you to then manipulate a number of different product solutions, etc.
And I understand that there's still a lot of people who use very standard passwords. Two-factor authentication is still not widely used. All this stuff that makes sure that you're the one you claim
to be. Right. So those, again, are two of the basics. And then the other third one for us is around doing the patch management and the updates of the system.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, the advice that I would give is to, to that hospital CEO and CIO or information security officer is when organizations like Philips and other manufacturers come out with, here is an update, we need to make sure we schedule and have the right alignment on updating of those systems, because again, if those patches and activities aren't then updated, then that becomes a greater risk that exists.
Yeah, I think it's the case that most of these attacks actually leverage weaknesses in the operating systems, so that if you're not on the latest version, they will exploit that. Is that what you see?
That's what I see. That's exactly what I see. And by not being on those latest versions, or again, if those latest versions have sunset because either the operating systems and those manufacturers that the external manufacturers, because again, that's a component. So if Philips builds our solutions on for example, a Microsoft, backbone, and they become obsolete, then when we have new solutions, we have to find a collective way of upgrading, the system.
And there are also ISO audits that help you. Let's say security reference frameworks that can help you hold your own organization accountable for where they are. What's your view on that?
No, my view is very positive. I think that especially when we look at cloud and movement of the data and information, making sure that the organizations, not only the manufacturers, but especially when you have cloud providers, data centers, that they follow a certain ISO standards and protocols. And ISO 27001 is usually the one.
Yeah.
And if we can assure that they have those in place and that they do appropriate annual assessments and audits, and again, as your higher risk organizations and your data, and you want to make sure that you're out there and doing those audits. We do them on the providers that we have in our environments, and we also make sure that our solutions also meet that particular ISO standard as well.
Well, thank you, Michael. So what we're seeing is, increasing threats. I think you gave a couple of very practical, pragmatic approaches to dealing with security. I think the importance cannot be underestimated. I think we as a company put this at the forefront, and I think we're also increasingly working with our customers to jointly come up with an end-to-end secure system. So you mentioned keeping your operating systems, everything up to date, really doing end-to-end encryption, making sure you have your identity and access management in place. And actually, I would like to add a fourth point, if you mind.
Not a problem.
Proactively monitor your network.
Yes.
Look for things that are out of the ordinary so that you can kind of lock it down before it starts to spread. But anyway, it's a fascinating topic. It will be with us for years to come. So thanks so much, Michael, for giving your views.
Thank you very much, Jeroen.